So Professor Katzenstein is the Walter S. Carpenter Junior Professor of International Studies at Cornell University, where he has taught since 1973. His work addresses issues of political economy, security, and culture in world politics. His current research interests focus on power and uncertainty in world politics, on time and space in the politics of civilizations and regions, and German and European politics. He's the author, co-author, or editor of over 40 books and more than 100 articles and book chapters. His recent work includes Uncertainty and Its Discontents and Downfalls, The End of the American Order. His contributions have also acclaimed. uh, The Culture of National Security was named one of the top 10 books in international relations by Choice magazine in 1997. Beyond Paradigms, co-authored with Rudra Sil, received Choice's Outstanding Academic Title Award in 2011, and Anglo-American and Its Discontents was selected as a Foreign Affairs magazine top pick in 2013. He's a recipient of the Johan Skytte Prize in 2020 and the Susan Strange Award in 2011, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the British Academy. With that, Pushkar, please speak it.
Professor Katzenstein, before we start formally with our questions, could you briefly reflect upon your academic career and some of the takeaways that you have sort of come up with after spending so much time studying international relations? I think that would be a good point to start in a preliminary note, after which we have an elaborate questionnaire awaiting you.
That's a really interesting question. I never sit back and reflect on that. The reason is that I don't look back, I look forward. I find my intellectual biography pretty boring. I find my intellectual path forward very exciting. So when I started, I was very influenced by, as you are, by your teachers, by my teacher, Karl Deutsch, who was, as I thought, a genius. He was somebody who wrote a book called The Nerves of Government, which ended with a chapter on love. This is most unusual in international relations then, as it is now. He had an incredibly capacious mind. And he did all of his work, I'm now looking back, all of his creative work in basically 5 years, early 1950s. A series of articles in which he put together what he had learned in his life together with Norbert Wiener's cybernetics. Cybernetics was for him opening up areas of scholarship, which he had, by studying nationalism, known well but not made original. And that created a burst of creativity in which he wrote 5 or 6 brilliant articles, which defined his career. My scholarly career was very different. I started where he was, and then I ambled around from topic to topic, not adhering to any school of thought, but to things which I found interesting. For example, I spent 8-10 years of my life looking at small countries in Europe. And I still remember a friend of mine saying, that's a crazy career choice because nobody's interested in small countries. And I said, that's the reason why I want to do it. There are about 170 small countries in the world, and everybody studies only the 5 big countries. That's a total waste of intellectual energy. So the absence of well thought out formulation about the role of small states in world politics was for me something interesting, even though professionally this wasn't a very smart move. I was hired here at Cornell as a Central European specialist. And I asked, what Central Europe? I mean, I knew the category from German, but it was something from pre-World War I. And they said, anything between Norway and Sicily. This I found very interesting. It was a north-south view of Europe. There was no east-west because the Cold War had truncated Europe into West and East, and Eastern Europe wasn't part of Europe. So I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. I'll come." Okay, because I could do a lot of European studies. And that I took advantage of that. And but then German unification came, and I had taught Germany in various forms, of course, and co-edited a book series with two colleagues here on comparative public policy, and wrote the German volume. And having taught Germany for a while, this was the easiest book I've ever written, because I taught the material. So this was a great revelation. If you really want to have an easy time writing, write on something which you've taught to your students. And the argument of that book was, that Germany was a semi-sovereign state. It wasn't fully sovereign. And that condition, I think, is a condition of modern politics. All states are semi-sovereign. They're not really sovereign. Sovereignty is a legal doctrine which describes something which doesn't really exist, full autonomy. The United States right now is learning, under the leadership of Donald Trump, that it's not fully sovereign. It'll be a harsh lesson, but they had it coming for a while, right? So I did a bunch of books on Germany, but from a condition influenced by my understanding of small states. Germany is a small state. It's not a giant on clay feet. And Germany has remained a small state, and it's very clear now its party system is that of a small state. They cannot lead Europe, and everybody's very happy that Germany is not leading Europe. Right? So that was sort of the first of my career, and then I sort of said, okay, I'm interested in broader issues. What does the world look like after the end of the Cold War? And to me, it was very clear. It was a regional world. And I wrote a book called The World of Regions. Came out in 2005. But I thought about it for a while and taught courses around that theme, right? And the reason I could do it is I had gotten interested in Japan in the 1980s, like many people did. Japan was going to be the world power of the 21st century, the way Germany was going to be the world power at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, it turned out to be wrong. And I learned that on my first visit to Japan in 1979. I met a demographer, and he said, they're all going to tell you that Japan will run the world. I can tell you they're wrong. And this is not speculation. It's based on the number of live births, which have happened in Japan. It's going to be a sharply declining population. So Japan will not run the world, right? But it gave me an entry into Japan, and I visited Japan often. I had many Japanese students. And what I found most interesting was the historical similarities of a fascist part in Germany and Japan, and the comparable U-turn after 1945, in which they said there was a really stupid policy. If we re-engineer ourselves, Japan under the leadership of MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and Germany as part of NATO and the EU, we will be comfortably settling in under the American empire and become trading states. So that comparison gave me an entryway into looking at East Asia and Europe as the two prime cases for my argument about the world of regions. And I extended the argument then to Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And having done the material part, that's the world of regions, I said, well, what about the ideational part? Because I'd done a book on constructivism in the mid-1990s, which you mentioned. So I did 3 volumes on civilizations. And that was extremely interesting. Why did I do 3 volumes on civilizations? Because I totally disagreed with Huntington. Huntington was my bête noire. And he wins every year over me. And my classes, undergraduate classes, I assign him and then I assign myself. And I ask, which one do you like better? They always like Huntington better. Okay. Great defeat every semester in my teaching. which is good because it makes you humble. Why do they like Hunting better? Because he's simplistic. It's like Mersheimer. Why do they like Mersheimer? Because he's simplistic. And I say, well, you want to understand the world? You can use it with a meat cleaver, or you can use it with a steak knife. I'm a steak knife guy. I'm not a meat cleaver guy. So anyway, I learned an enormous amount, including about China. I had many Chinese graduate students who then became professors in China. So I traveled to China once a year, basically, for about 15 years. Found it very exciting. And like the rest of the world, I'm depressed about what's happened to China in the last 10 years. So this work on civilizations, rounded out my understanding of world politics. And then the crisis of 2008 came, and it had a profound effect on me, the financial crisis. I mean, I remember my colleagues looked at me, well, what's happening, and I come from Germany, and I said, well, I never thought I would experience Black Monday in my lifetime. Black Monday, 1929 in Germany was traumatic because it led to fascism. So I remember giving my first lecture without having prepared it to my undergraduate course, saying, after the financial crisis, bad things are going to happen. And then Obama got elected. Never forgotten that. I was dead wrong, okay? As everybody else is always dead wrong. It's not only I am wrong, everybody is wrong, right? So I tried to figure out, what about this financial crisis? And read finance economics and wrote 3 papers with a student, learning that uncertainty is a foreign territory in financial economics. The central banks didn't have a model of the financial system. Why? Because uncertainty cannot be modeled. And the prevailing model of the previous 30 years, rational expectation, was a disaster. It was totally wrong. So later on, it dawned on me that this is not just a question of finance. This is a question of politics. That is, the conception of power, which we subscribe to in our profession, is Hobbesian. It goes all the way back to Hobbes. It's all about control, material resources, and probabilities. Robert Dahl's famous article on power in 1957 talks about power is, the probability, affecting a probability distribution based on the science as we know it. The science he was referring to was Newtonianism. And I'm not a scientist, but I knew there was quantum physics, and it wasn't Newtonian. So he was about 60 years out of turn, because quantum physics, the revolution, starts in 1900. So that got me interested in power. So I did a book on power called Protean Power. Protean, after Proteus, who is the son of Poseidon, which is the power of the unexpected. And when I finished that, there were 12 case studies, former students. I drafted former students to do this, So it was theoretically motivated. I wrote with the late Lucia Seibert, who was a student of mine who died prematurely of cancer. It was very tragic and difficult. But we theorized power from this perspective and provided empirical evidence in many different case studies. So then I went on, this was before the pandemic, 2018, I went on the road and I gave about 20 lectures and seminar presentations. And every last one, once I finished my little spiel, I got the same question. And the question was, this is all very interesting, Professor Katzenstein. As in, are you crazy? That was sort of the feeling in the room, right? But let me translate it into my own language. And the language was unfailingly Newtonian. This I found extremely interesting, because the Protean concept of power is based not on Newtonian physics. It's based on quantum physics. So then I said, this is so interesting. The grip of this Newtonian worldview is something I want to understand. So I did a book on worldviews and world politics, came out in 2022. in which I talk about Newtonianism as a worldview and post-Newtonianism, and I talk about humanism and what I called in that book hyperhumanism, but which I now call parahumanism, something which goes beyond humanism and around humanism, but doesn't replace humanism. Just like quantum physics does not replace Newtonianism. Newtonianism is a special case. So that was an extremely, I did that book, fought a lot with my collaborators, and some of them were former students or colleagues, were extremely interesting. And my wife then said, well, it's all very interesting, so where's the beef? What can you show that it matters, that what you're thinking about uncertainty matters? So I just finished a book on, what is it called? Entanglements in World Politics, the Power of Uncertainty. And it theorizes, uncertainty at the beginning, and it offers 3 case studies on finance, on the Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear crisis, and on the environment and artificial intelligence. And then I summarized the power chapter, the power book in 1 chapter. So looking back, this is where I am now. My next book will be on Germany. Looking back, you can see I didn't have a plan. I was guided always by looking forward. Okay. And that's why your question is interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms.
That was indeed a masterful exposition. And you referred to a lot of pointers which will come up over the course of this conversation. And I would now ask Anshu to unmute and go ahead with our question. Anshu, please go ahead.
Yes, sure, Pushkar. So, Professor Katzenstein, I happened to first come across your idea of protein power in a video series by Cornell, where you sort of talked about it in the light of the fall of the Berlin Wall. After that, I sort of read your paper on protein power and uncertainty, which you co-authored. And to therefore sort of begin our formal conversation on, you've sort of pointed out an aperture, which is the fact that uncertainty doesn't really exist as a category worthy of analysis. Why do you think that is the case within academics as such?
I think because we are afraid. That is, we all encounter uncertainty in our personal lives. We are all tripped up by uncertainty in our professional lives. Professors always say on the one hand and on the other. They're always two-handed, right? But even with the 2 hands, they never get it right. And because it is philosophically and epistemologically a very difficult subject. So the Newtonian worldview, which grips us as normal living being and as scholars, offers a way out. It says there is control, the gravitational pull. And for some social situations, this is true. I mean, if you're a demographer, like this Japanese demographer, he wasn't making it up. He told me those babies are born and they're not as large numbers as before. Japan will be a declining power, right? If you go to the casino, I would advise against you, you will lose. The house rules are stacked against you, okay? So it turns out that in the study of politics, most political science assumes that the world operates like a casino, that it has a Gaussian distribution, a nice smooth curve with short tails, right? So this turns out to be wrong. Most statistical distributions in world politics are not Gaussian, they're power distributions. They got long tails. So the so-called black swan lives in the long tail. And the black swan is something with statistics you can compute, but uncertainty you cannot compute. And when I started graduate school, I couldn't imagine that we could talk the way we are talking now. And neither could any of my teachers. Right? And I still remember I'm talking to a friend in the mid-1980s, he was in California, and they were about 10 years ahead, politically and intellectually, when it came to the computer revolution. And I wrote them in the early 1980s, that, I think I want to sit this one out, the computer revolution. I couldn't imagine it, right? So uncertainty is probabilities you can calculate. You can specify the options, and you can calculate the odds. Uncertainty, you may know the options, but you don't know the outcomes. And radical uncertainty, you neither know the options nor the outcomes. Right? So look at Donald Trump today. It says, I will create peace in the Ukraine on day one. He knows the options, and he knows the outcome. The outcome is peace, and the options are, I, Donald Trump, by the weight of my power and by the compellingness of my deal-making, will show them the way. Right? And most of us said, he's an idiot. He doesn't understand world politics. Putin will lead him along. And of course, Putin has led him along, right? So what's he doing? He's going to sell the Ukraine to Russia. Okay, that's the deal which is on the table. It's going to cost him politically if he does that, and he knows it. So he's getting a little nervous, right? But uncertainty is about things where you're not sure what the options are and you can't calculate the odds. And all of social science is based, hard social science, not anthropology or area studies, hard social, is based on knowing the options and calculating the odds.
Thank you, Professor Katzenstein, for that. Since you talked about the Newtonian foundations of at least the mainstream Maya theory, it sort of leads me to ask you the question that, your earlier work with Rudra Sil on analytic eclecticism, can that be sort of seen as a kind of ontological departure from the quantum turn that you are talking about in IR? Is that part of the same wave that sort of tries to get beyond the Newtonian foundations?
I think it's an acknowledgement that general laws of the kind of the law of gravitation, a social physics, a political physics, do not exist. That doesn't mean that you can't do social science. Of course you can do social science. But it's not a social science in which, you and I, we all work in our little quarries and we create rocks and then we build one big, fine, beautiful cathedral. That's not how it works. We will provide, stones for little chapels, and we'll stand at the entrance and say, come in, this is a nice little chapel, right? And of course, when you go shopping, you say, well, I'd like to look at that chapel and that chapel and that chapel. I didn't like the other one down the road at all. And out of those visits, you create for your particular questions a set of understandings. So in your seminars, at least here at Cornell, it's called specifying the scope conditions for your analysis. Well, when that part of the talk comes and here, everybody sort of looks at their iPhone. It's like somebody says, fasten your seatbelt in an airplane. Okay, when they say that, I tune out, I do other things. I've heard that so often, right? Turns out that scope conditions are vital, right? Scope conditions, you have to be very thoughtful in getting it right, and then you can do social science. Here's another one. When they have done their scope conditions, they run their regression models, right? So you run a regression based on, a data set of 20 years or 100 years or whatever, right? And sometimes you enlarge it by saying, well, I will not do annual data, I'll do monthly data, I'll do daily data, so that you got enough statistical observations. But it is always things which happened in the past. You're post-dicting the future. You're saying by explaining the past, I can explain and predict the future. That may be true if the underlying process is invariant, if there are no changes. but most social processes are not invariant. They are not, they from one day to the next, many processes are invariant. From 1 year to the next, many processes are invariant. 10 years, a lot of political processes change. So using regressions of 10, 20, or 100 years looking backwards for predicting, it's a big risk that you're getting it wrong, right? So we make the social world look as close to the material, inanimate world as possible so that we can play our Newtonian games. And eclecticism is based on the intuition that this is the wrong way of doing it. And in this book, which I know, I have a section at the end on pragmatism and eclecticism, which I think avoids this bias.
Thank you, Professor Katzenstein, for that. I also wanted to ask you another question based off eclecticism, which is, somebody like Shapiro, for instance, you've mentioned in the book in chapter 1, has called a flight from reality. And, you and Seal have essentially tried to strike a balance between the theoretical detachment and practical engagement of these policy terms, at least. You mentioned, I believe, Annie Norton, who sort of talked about the problem-oriented scholarship can risk becoming complicit in legitimizing dominant power structures. So how does this analytic eclecticism of sorts navigate this double bind that's there? Sort of, being relevant to the real-world dilemmas as well as without becoming instrumentalized by, say, policy agendas?
I think the question of relevance, right? Let's take that one first. All social and political analysis is always relevant. The question is whether the analyst knows about her or his positionality in relationship to the reality which they live and which they want to affect, right? So if you're saying, no, I'm doing basic social science, I'm only doing counterfactual, so I'm only doing simulation, or only doing history, macro history, or whatever kind of history, right? You think you have removed yourself from engaging with the world. You never remove yourself from engaging with the world. It's impossible. You might just say, I don't have much to say, or I'm not interested in the world, but you're still in it. To pay the bills, you got to teach, or you got to work, or got to publish, or you got to become an influencer on the social media, The world is always around you. So this practical engagement, this is why, for me, pragmatism is the guiding philosophy. I write about pragmatism together with eclecticism at the end, also about religion and science. But the pragmatist turn of the last 100 years makes it possible to engage the world with whatever work you do. So if you're saying, no, I'm not interested in what's happening now or the future, it's too grim, and it is grim, but it's also hopeful. It can always turn, right? Therefore, I'm doing history. Well, the past is as unpredictable as the future, right? Why? Because historians rewrite the past. Why do they rewrite the past? Because they are positioned differently in the world than the book which they read about the French Revolution. Turns out the French Revolution never existed. The people creating the revolution in 1789 didn't know that they were in a French Revolution. They just lived their lives trying to kill this person or that person or make bread or whatever. And then later on, historians said, you know what? That was the French Revolution. It did things. It becomes so powerful that it creates stuff. Right? And then somebody comes along and says, no, there was no French Revolution. We just made that up. So you can use the history as indeterminate as the future. We live in the moment right now. By the way, the moment has just passed, right? Now we live in another moment. Turns out that where we live is the greatest secret of physics. The classical modern Newtonianism has no understanding of the now, which is where we live. The past and the future, always indeterminate. right?
When we tend to think of the world in very ordered terms, we think of, say, a couple of nations which are combating each other. But with the proliferation of weapons of, say, mass destruction, which have now also been acquired by states like North Korea, what
Okay.
implications does this proliferation of destructive capacities have? And would you view this development through the lens of protean power or the concept of, say, control power? I think that's the essence of Adamya's question.
Yeah. Adamya, that's a very good question. Sorry that I have a hard time hearing you. So my basic answer in all of these last 3 books is that both and beats either or. Control power and protean power are always linked, as are uncertainty and risk. I call it the uncertainty risk conundrum. So it's not either or, and I don't think that this is something which, is linked to weapons of mass destruction, North Korea having the bomb. I think it's generic in the categories and the experiences which we have. So it would be foolish to deny the influence of control power in world politics, just as it would be foolish to deny the importance of protean power. Since most of the time in our analysis we deny protean power, my foolishness is different than the foolishness of my colleagues, right? So I'm not going to go into the trap of saying, is it either or? Rather saying, once we have the right conceptual, for my questions, the right conceptual apparatus, we are able to understand the reality of world politics better than if we are, relying only on one or the other. There are moments of madness in world politics, particularly in domestic politics, where the revolutionary upheaval changes everything in an unpredictable way in a very short time. But most of the time, elements of control power are part of it, right? So I think it's not related to the stage of technology. It's not related to us now compared to the past. It was just the same in the past as it is now. There's nothing specific here. We've gotten better at calculating statistics. Risk was invented as a way of thinking about the world about 400 years ago. Aristotle didn't know probability distributions. So the sciences, of course, are forever making headway. That is, learning more. That doesn't mean that we know more, because every scientific advance opens up new seas of unknown things. So the more we know, the less we know. I know a whole lot less now than I did when I finished my PhD. I finished my PhD, or when I wrote my qualifying exams, I was on top of the mountain. I knew everything. There was an incredible feeling of control. Now, after 50 years, I know a whole lot more, and I know much less, because I'm aware of all the things I don't know. And not aware of all of them, but I know many, many things I don't know, right? So the notion of scientific advance must be based on the notion of humility, that as science advances, so does our ignorance. And that is why in the next 2,000 years, science is so interesting. It's always new. There's always more to learn.
Good evening, Professor. Am I audible to you?
Yeah,
Hello?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Apologies for that. So, your answer right now is, I'm a student of sociology, so this comes from a different tangent. So, apologies for that as well. But as a student of sociology, your answer reminded me of Michel Foucault's idea of commentality, and particularly how coercion works across the world right now. So, in the digital age, how do you think the concept of state power has evolved, particularly pertaining to its citizens, and what ramifications do you think it holds on a macro level regarding the same?
If I get the question right, saying what's the role of coercion? how the state power affects citizens? Yeah? Okay. Take India. Okay. I've traveled to India more than to any other country because my wife was an India specialist before she started doing other things. So I carried the suitcase for many trips, and we eat a lot of Indian food in our house. We got a lot of Indian friends. So I followed Indian politics. Okay. And it is a dismal story and very relevant to American politics right now. Okay. I thought, with all my squash partners with whom I played, all of them Indians, that India was too diverse to ever be succumbed or coerced into giving up much of its diversity and much of its democracy. But that is exactly what has happened. Okay. So coercion doesn't mean necessarily the Nazi solution, killing the people, right? Killing the other. You can't really slaughter 250 million Muslims. It's not possible. Okay. There are some people in India who'd like to do it, but it's a daydream. That's not going to happen. How do you disempower? Right? How do you shift power away? Well, you disempower and hollow out institutions. That's what's happened in India. That is what's unfolding here in the United States now. Okay. This is what's happened in Hungary over the last 10 years. This happened in Russia between 1999 and 2012. And of course, accelerated since 2012. This has happened on a vast scale in China. Okay. But vastly accelerated by Xi Jinping since 2017. So this is a more general model of coercion by eliminating institutions which have autonomous powers, constitutionally guaranteed, but more importantly, embedded in practice. Okay. And in America, you can see, I mean, we are all fighting, okay, right now. You don't see it in India, but it's happening, okay? And social movements take time. And America is deeply divided. Donald Trump has a lot of support, okay? So coercion, to me, for somebody like John Mearsheimer, who's a materialist, coercion means brute power, right? Material power. How many divisions has the Pope? Asked Stalin. Right? And he was laughing. He said, the Pope has no divisions. The Pope has the Vatican Guard. You can see them right now. Last week, they look, they look a little funny in their silk pants, in their metal helmets, and with the halberd. Well, if you go back to military history, the halberd was made by Swiss knife makers and was put on a big stick, and it was the intercontinental missile of the 13th century. That is, it could do to the helmet of the opponent what my can opener does to my can of tuna fish after we are finished. Okay? So the Pope in the 13th century had the superior military technology in Europe. He was a military superpower. But for Stalin, he said, these people in silk pants. That's all we got, with a knife on a stick, right? Well, Stalin may have been right for the 1940s, but the end of the Cold War was vastly influenced in Poland by a Catholic Pope who was Pole, who wanted to defeat communism. And he did, right? So the power of ideas in particular historical situations varies, right? So coercion of the kind which I sense is spreading now on social media, but I'm not part of this world, in the early 2000s, my students started writing, "Do you want to be my friend?" And I said, "No, I don't want to be your friend. I'm your teacher. I'm not your friend. And then I realized, I had in my guts, I said, this is going to be really bad, right? Everybody being friend with everybody else. Turned out, of course, that the billionaires, who emerged, saying we want to make the world better, they were right in saying we become billionaires, but they didn't make the world better. Okay. So this coercion takes different forms. Right now, for you students, it's bullying on the web. That's coercive, deeply coercive, right? But if you think about democratic public discourse in India or in the United States, it's made almost impossible by this new form of coercion, right? So if you have to put material and ideational power together, I think you do. Only one or the other is not enough. We are living at a coercive moment in history. I think that's true.
And as a follow-up to that, Professor Katzenstein, it's true that some of the most direct and the most brutal ramifications or results of such coercion happens to be domestic against marginalized populations of a particular country. But at the same time, a lot of revanchist rhetoric is also concomitant and driven by such forms of coercion, wherein you have, say, the indoctrination of even an entire or a substantial chunk of the populace who will continue voting in certain people into power who happen to represent a certain mission and vision that they happen to identify with. What sort of impact do you think such a milieu in democratic discourse will have on international relations in our times, especially given how pervasive social media has become now?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question, but both of your questions, Shub, and your question are both on either or, domestic or international. I think I've always, I got my job here because I said, and I taught in my first year the field seminar, the graduate seminar in comparative politics and international relations, because that's a phony distinction. Okay, to the great consternation of my elder colleagues who said, but aren't we organized this way? I said, yeah, but the world isn't organized this way. We are organized. Scholarship is organized into disciplines and fields and subfields, but the world isn't. These are categories which we created to organize knowledge. But if you want to understand the world, you can't be living in your silo, right? And of course, the silos have proliferated in my lifetime. Right? So I think I think there's great suffering in the world in domestic and in international affairs. Take refugee migrants, right? This will be hundreds of millions of people, upsetting the political stability of all major areas in the world. We're already now saying enough is enough. This is happening in the United States. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in Japan. It's not yet happening in Russia. Russia has a much greater capacity, apparently. Central Asia, it's very interesting. People don't ever focus on this, but eventually will happen in Russia too, right? So this nativist impulse against the outsider is also the nativist impulse against people who have come in already and look different, right? I think it's the same kind of dynamic, and it is, I think, a very pressing issue because violence and coercion are just underneath the surface, right? Could it become? So China is putting millions of people into camps. They're not killing camps, the Uyghurs, okay? But they are quote unquote re-education camps. They're Orwellian. They rob people of their culture and language, and that's a fundamental human rights violation, right? And China tries to say, oh, this is not happening. Well, it is happening. We all know it, but it's never getting mentioned. Instead, it's the Silk Road and China is the world power of the 21st century, but brutal repression of diversity at home, right? The two are linked. China building railways in Africa, they bring in their own supervisors, and those supervisors directing African workforces, of course, bring their own prejudices. China is a deeply racist society abroad in Africa, right? So I think you can see it at home and abroad. And what seems to have shifted, is that it won't take much for Europe to turn rightist. It's hanging by a thread, Next election in France or in Germany could well turn Europe, right? So then you would have India, China, the United States, and Europe. Turns out not Canada right now, okay, as of this morning. But Canada may be swallowed up by that right-wing politics. Donald Trump, certainly yesterday, Canadians are voting, saying, you will become the 51st state. Okay. So that, Gaza will become a golf course. I think Gaza becoming a golf course is less likely than Canada becoming a 51st state. But they're both low probability events, right? So I just think, Pushkar, you're right in the political intuition, but I wouldn't separate out domestic and international.
I acknowledge this, sir. I just have a similar question, which also, this time, instead of positing a distinction, is a methodological one pertaining to how you have tried to invoke culture while understanding the behavioral states as well. Now, in your book, I have read how systematically you have presented your views, but at the same time, the application of culture, or when a lot of scholars invoke cultural explanations, one criticism that they often encounter is that such explanations turn out to be essentialist. So a similar cultural explanation leads to different results. And I think this also coheres with your argument that power is often protean in nature rather than something that we can analyze in deterministic terms as following a certain trajectory. How have you sort of invoked cultural explanations without falling into the pitfalls of essentialism, like many other scholars often do? I think Huntington himself, for instance.
Yeah. So it's very easy to beat up on the essentialists, right? What does an end? But I want to reframe it a little to see that we are in some form, all of us are essentialist. Essentialism is compressing a complex process or set of processes into categories. That's what Newtonianism is. So structural functionalism in the 1950s and 1960s says culture matters. How do we measure culture? Values. Okay. And the Paulus said, well, values are not culture. Culture is human practices and institutions, and it's flowing. It's not compressed as variables, right? So Ronald Inglehart, from Michigan, makes his career and writes very much about postmodernism, the post-material generation. There was a lot of insight and truth there. And he compresses that notion of post-materialism out of materialism to create a variable which he can stick into his equations, right? For some reason, compression is absolutely useful and helpful, as long as you know that that is what you're doing, right? That in fact, life out there isn't a variable. In fact, most of the time, often, when you listen to a lecture and somebody says, my independent variable is this, and my dependent variable is that, they use the hand motion to tell the audience that this is a compression. This isn't a real variable. Variable is a category they use in order to compress reality. Since culture is so complex and evanescent and ever-changing, essentialism used on cultural explanations seems to have more clout. But we do compression a lot, all of us, because otherwise, what would we have? We would have situated descriptions of very specific locales, space, and time periods. And this is what a lot of anthropology is, right? But it rarely goes from that to explicating the logic of a situation. When anthropologists explicate, which is describe and explain, they are entering the compression. Since you mentioned Hunting, Hunting and the book end, he has a map of the world, right? And the civilizations are coded in color. So Hunting is brilliant, I mean, I knew him pretty well. I respect him enormously, right? He's one of the best writers we've had in political science. This is still the most important book of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. But it's dead wrong because the compression is wrong. China is not, take Islam, green. So the difference between Sunni and the Shia doesn't appear. It's all Islam. This is crazy. This is not analysis. This is totally crazy. If you're in the Muslim world, of which we have about 2.5 billion, right, to say, well, it's all Islam. Islam is a very heterodox global civilization. And most of the time, Euro-Islam, very different from Afro-Islam, because it gets translated and morphs into various local traditions, sub-regional, regional, national, super-regional, whatever, right? So in order to find Huntington compelling, you must be willing to lop off a lot of world politics. You operating with a cleaver, with a meat cleaver. So what Hunting does for the cultural world, John Mearsheimer does for the material world. It's a particular way of compressing. And it has enormous popular appeal. John Mearsheimer, a former student of mine, is a brilliant lecturer, a great teacher, a dedicated public intellectual. And he hits, like Huntington, he hits the public. Why? Because the public wants things simple. But he's wrong. So was Huntington. You can be brilliant and wrong, and yet have enormous public influence in the public discourse. Anyway, essentialism is a form of compression we all have to engage in, and we have to make a choice when it's the right way to do it and when it's not. Huntington wrote in his book, every other page, he says, "Dear reader, I want to change the way you see the world," after the end of the Cold War. He's very honest about it. He's not hiding it. And then he says, the worldview which he's at, the theory which he operates is a very old one. It's not a new one, right?
Thank you for that answer, Professor. And since you answered my last question, actually, Pushkar asked you 2 more, but I started thinking of this then only. So sorry for taking you on another tangent. But like much of your work and other scholars' work also underscore how identity in international politics is not merely instrumental, but also constitutive, shaped by historical narratives, institutional practices, and cultural repertoires. So along those same lines, in today's world, identity politics along ascriptive lines like race, gender, ethnicity, and religion has reemerged as a potent force not only within states, but also shaping foreign policy and institutional and international alignment. So how do you see the international and national effects of these ascriptive identity claims? You could take the example of things like racial solidarity. And in the last answer you gave to me, you also mentioned migrants. So I would like to ask you, to what extent can identity politics generate solidarities across borders?
It's a political project, right? So identity politics can divide, and identity politics can unite. So cosmopolitanism, liberalism, let's say, is a version of cosmopolitanism, says let's try to bridge, right? That's one kind of identity politics. The other kind of identity politics is, let's divide. That is, I want my tribe, you have your tribe, and let's not cross-talk. I don't like that. Let's not cross-marry. Let's not eat together. Let's not play together. Let's not learn together, right? I think it relates to, how afraid are you of something which is new, right? Turns out that, the country I know best, Germany, they're all very much into soccer, playing soccer. Half of the German soccer team is African. That's sort of interesting. When I grew up, there was no African soccer player in Germany. So somehow the Germans have been able to compartmentalize, especially on the right. The right, the AfD, is about, a quarter of the electorate. They don't like migrants. But when they go on Saturday or Sunday and cheer their soccer team, they sure will cheer their African soccer player. So I think both processes are always there. People are more or less aware of it. And the political struggles are about which side can define the national, regional, or international discourse. So the revolution in world politics, which we are living through right now, is the turning of the United States from a liberal version of let's talk across to a nativist version of saying, no, we are afraid, we don't want to talk across. And you can't undo. Once you change your mind on this, it'll take a long time for people saying, oh, you changed your mind again? So what Donald Trump, I don't know what's going to come, but what he has destroyed is pretty clear to me, right? So these are two different political projects, and identity politics, I grew up with my wife, who was first generation feminism, very different from second generation, very different from third generation, very different from intersectionality, very different from what's happening post-intersectionality. These are all theoretical and political moves of political contestation. And that is it's not the only thing world politics is about, but it's an important part. So human rights, I think, is an extremely important social process. And I don't think it can be put back into the bottle, even by Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi, and Mr. Trump. I think it's more powerful than that. And that's why I'm basically saying on this side, on human rights, I think the humanity will stand up for its rights, even though in various countries it may be incarcerated and murdered and put into camps for years and decades. But the human rights revolution, which to me is part of the post-colonial world, right? That is the end of imperialism, is a shift in world politics that makes the 20th century much more important than the struggle between capitalism and communism, which I think will be forgotten.
Thank you for that answer, sir. And I will just take one more follow-up on this line. So, recently I was watching a interview by Professor Vivek Chhibbar of the New York University. He teaches sociology there, and he's spoken multiple times on this as well, and he has a very vehement criticism of the intersectionality movement in theory, where he calls it as the elite capture of the left, as intersectionality in some way takes away the class aspect, the class consciousness aspect of left-wing politics, and replaces it with an elite-induced intersectional one. And he's also he's not stated that per se, but many commentators have also stated that this is also one of the ways that dismissive nature of intersectionality theory means that many people who would usually be put into the left-wing camp are being pushed to the right. So I would like to ask you, so he critiqued the intersectionality and fragment class analysis and that it obscures universal solidarities. In your opinion, how might we integrate multiple identity dimensions such as gender, race, and class into a coherent framework that retains both analytical clarity, normative inclusivity, and is acceptable to many?
Very good. I'm sure you can spend your lifetime as a scholar on trying to solve it. But in the political world, you need a charismatic political leader. I don't think ordinary political leaders can do this. Okay. And I regard Donald Trump as a charismatic political leader. He has great charisma. Okay. Obama had charisma. This was part of Obama's project, right? So this notion, that class has been denigrated, and that this is the reason why the ascendance of the backlash against liberal cosmopolitanism is due to that. I'm sure it's part of the story, but I'm also sure it's not the story, right? Think about the transformation of the party system over the last 150 years. So the working class parties, take Scandinavia, declined dramatically, or Germany, right? Why? Because the character of what class politics was about was changed. So Donald Trump wants to recreate the manufacturing working class in America. And I say, good luck to you. You don't even live in the 1970s. You live in the 1950s, right? So if there's foreign investment in order to get around the tariffs, the modern manufacturing plant will have robots and engineers who have to fix the robots. They won't be workers, right? So Biden, who spent a lot of money, most in conservative states, it was deliberate, wanted to create a huge amount of employment. Yeah, he's created employment, 50, 70,000 jobs. Had nothing to do. I mean, no political significance whatsoever. Right? So class politics changes as technology changes society. And we are now in a knowledge society where, 1/3 to 1/2 is in the upper position, living nicely, and 1/3 to 1/2 are in the lower position, not living nicely. They have the menial jobs, collecting the garbage, taking care of our old, working as semi-skilled nurses in hospitals, all those things, right? And that service economy is not easily divided into the means of production owned by the owners of capital and the working class. There was a bifurcation of the material project. This is no longer true. And therefore, class politics of the traditional type has disappeared. Which is not to say that poverty and inequality have disappeared, not at all. Right? So it's a political project. I think analytically, you're welcome to the club of political theorists who do this very well. Okay, and they go back into the past and reinterpret past theorists, and they project it into politics in which they live now and extract from it. I mentioned 4 generations of feminism in my lifetime, and that is going on and multiplying. So there's a difference, I think, between the intellectual project and the political project.
Thank you so much for that. So it reminds me somehow Max Weber and Professor Chabber's ideas after the cultural turn as he considers the left-wing politics after 60s and 70s. So thank you so much for that. Very great.
Thank you.
Ishwaditya also had a question. Yes, he switched on his camera.
I hope I'm audible.
You're very audible. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Hello, sir. So my question is along the following lines. A lot of your work argues that, contemporary forms of power are unstable, right? They're shifting and they often emerge from unpredictable interactions. Now, Deleuze and Guattari conceptualize the flow of power not necessarily as hierarchical, but as emerging in a rhizomatic direction, like fluid, decentralized networks that constantly reconfigure. So do you think that this conception of power helps us better understand, cause being this rhizomatic flow, for the effect being then protean power, rather than simply through a traditional state-centric hierarchy?
So I think I can do, yes. The first answer is yes, it gets to reality more than the traditional Hobbesian analysis. But the same criticism can be applied to network analysis. There's network analysis sees power and influence as flows, as processes, which I think is an advantage. But most network analysis I know focuses on network nodes. As soon as you create a node, you're compressing the flow. That is, you're compressing reality, right? So people further out who are more processual will say, oh, wait a minute. What about that node of power there in Washington? You say, well, it's the IMF, it's the World Bank, it's the United States. And say, yeah, but that needs to be disaggregated, right? So the logic of disaggregation and decompression can be applied at any level. So my first answer is yes, it is an advance. Okay. My second answer is, yeah, but the argument can still be made. So what's at the bottom of it? At the bottom of it, I think philosophically are two versions of systems. One is a closed system and one is an open system. So Robert Jervis wrote a wonderful book on systems analysis, 1997, okay? Informed by writing on chaos theory. He recognizes that the Newtonian system is too closed. He wants to open it up, which is right. But then his open system is in fact embedded in a closed system, right? So can you have a totally open system? If we do, can we use analysis on it? That's a really challenging question. And I think for the most part, at some level, we will have to impose closure. Okay. What's the right level? You can't say that in the abstract. That's why I always think, as a theorist, like good friend Alex Wendt, who's a theorist, right? He couldn't care less about the problem in the world. He goes at it from the perspective of theory. I focus on something in the world which interests me. And given the interest in the world, the particular question, the problem or the problem area, I have intuitions about where I will impose closure. But that's an intuition. It's not a guide. It's not that clear in my head. I couldn't teach it, right? But I think we all will find it. And in a dissertation or in a master thesis or in a BA honors thesis, the first thing you have to do as a teacher is say, what's your question? And typically the question, I'm interested, honors thesis is here, I'm interested in nuclear weapons in the 20th century. I say, that's a great question. But you can't write an honors thesis about it. Can you make that more specific, right? And so eventually that thesis becomes the threat of nuclear weapons in the hand of Putin's in the Ukraine war, a very specific episode, right? For which the student can then say, my intuition is I want to stop the analysis here, right? So there are two different ways of dealing with this. And for Alex Wendt, as a theorist, he wants to get it all right. He wants to have it all grounded, epistemologically and ontologically. And I say, Alex, you know what? That's not me. So I'm perfectly happy with the category of epiontology. It's turtles all the way down. There is no difference between knowledge and being. We are who we are because we know, and knowing is what being is. That for him is an inadequate answer. He wants a coherent ontology and a coherent epistemology. He is thinking like a theorist and philosopher. I'm not. I take a shortcut.
Right. I believe Adi has a question. Adi, please feel free to go ahead. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. So my question to you is your 1947 occasional paper from many one and from one many political unification, political fragmentation, and cultural cohesion in Europe since 1815 presages later an analysis of corporatist state society rearrangement, recalling that you linked inclusive tripatriate governance to social stability. How might a 21st century corporatist revival address the political fragmentation driven by populist movements across advanced democracies?
I had a very hard time focusing on your question, Adya, because from many one and from one many. I mean, I think I wrote a paper on this once. Was one of they used here at Cornell. They had occasional papers in the European Studies program, and I think that's the paper I wrote. It was the appendix to my first book. What was the question for me then? Why did let me rephrase it. Why did Karl Deutsch think about pluralistic security communities? And he was tasked with figuring out what the professors at Princeton couldn't solve. They called him up and said, "Can you spend a year with us? Because you're a great student of nationalism, and you have a sensibility about the Austro-Hungarian Empire." The task for the researchers at Princeton in 1953-54 was NATO had been created. They wanted to theorize NATO. And they were trying to do it within a Hobbesian framework where states are in control, and they couldn't make headway. So they called up Deutsch. Deutsch came for a year, and he developed the concept of a pluralistic security community based on the dependable expectations of peaceful change. And he said that can happen, or that is often true within nation states. But lo and behold, this can also happen between nation states. So Canada and the United States are a pluralistic security community. I think the last fortification was eliminated in the 1840s. And eventually they signed a treaty. When you eliminate defense fortifications along your border, you're saying war is no longer on the table, right? We are a security community, but we are plural. So that became the concept for NATO. And in some ways, it became the concept for Europe, not for Eastern Europe yet, but for Western Europe. A pluralistic security community, which is why Russia, the failure of integrating Russia into it is a historic failure. And maybe it would have failed under all conditions. But Europeans and the United States were unsuccessful in integrating Russia into that security community. So this is thinking about pluralism in the international context. Sweden, Norway, a pluralistic security community. Ireland and Britain, although there's tensions there. They had wars, they had civil unrest, they had rebellions, right? But still, I think it has the making of the pluralistic security community. So I think this is one answer, but I'm pretty sure, Adya, that I didn't hear you correctly because I was thinking about this part. Did you talk also about domestic politics?
Sir, I believe Adya's question was also about corporatism in the 21st century, and especially how in your paper, the occasional paper that she referred to, from many one and from one many, and the part about it which talks about corporatist state and society arrangements and tripartite governance to social stability, her question was about this linkage and how would this linkage proceed, and what sort of a say economic or political economic setup would one conceive of given the corporatist revival given the backdrop of, say, political fragmentation and populism, which many societies have seen, whether it be Brazil, Eastern Europe, or the United States. So, I think it was more of a question along the lines of political economy.
Yeah, okay. So the corporatist bargain in Europe was either a bargain around confessional lines, religion, or ethnic linguistic lines. And it was saying, we have had religious wars and class wars in Europe, but we live in these small societies and we can't afford to be split open either by civil war or great civil dissents. So let's make a deal in which we divvy up power and neuter power. So the rule was proportionality. Normally by some demographic characteristic, sometimes by some territorial characteristic, but most importantly by taking off the table fighting about controlling the whole. If somebody wants to control everything, that doesn't work. We all agree that that would be too dangerous. And out of that corporatist bargain emerged then consensual political economies, which can be competitive in international markets, either under the hegemony, the leadership of labor or of capital. So labor would have been Austria, capital would have been Switzerland, but also Belgium and also the Netherlands. Labor was much stronger in Sweden and in Norway, but in a balance which varied by country. But everybody agreed nobody should try to grab all of power. That was the corporate bargain. And when I finished writing that book, it began to unravel. This is true of most books, that is, technological change was undermining the stability of these things. So, but if you look at Belgium, which has basically a failed corporate system for the last 30 years, it's doing pretty well. Because the agreement that nobody try to control all of it is still there. My hunch is, it's no more than a hunch, if you project this argument onto the European level, that Meloni in Italy and possibly in France, when they turn right-wing, if they turn right-wing, even Germany, if it were run by a coalition government headed by the AfD, given European history, will agree that nobody should try to run the whole show. That the seizure of power, 1933 style, is no longer an option in Europe. It certainly isn't an option in small countries. But my hunch is that the big countries in Europe have shrunk. Germany certainly has. And that this mentality isn't there any longer. That even when it's a right-wing state, if it's a Europe of the nation states, even of the ethno-nation states, that it will be very unlikely that somebody will say, we are going for the whole thing, and if we win, we will put everybody into a concentration camp. I think that's unlikely to happen. Right? So the political economy of compromise of the 1950s to the 1980s was very effective because it looked at the international arena and said, that's pretty risky in itself. We better compromise and be competitive. And when it turned out that that model of competitiveness didn't work any longer in Sweden or in Denmark, they reorganized themselves. Sweden is not a social democratic country any longer. Denmark is highly conservative. But the way the economy works has maintained its own implicit corporatist element. It is adaptable and adjustable.
Right. So we just have two more questions, I think. I hope you'll have time to respond to them before we come to a close.
One more, yeah.
One more. Okay, we'll end with one more. And the question is from is Vivan. Vivan's already switched on his camera. Vivan, you can unmute.
Hi, Professor Katzenstein. My question goes like this. So, in a world of regions where you conceptualize Asia, Europe, and other parts of the interstate system as quote unquote regional security complexes with their own cultural institutional logics, given today's intensifying great power competition, how can this regional lens help us grasp why the European Union member states responded so differently from the Association for Southeast Asian Nation members to external strategic pressure? And what does that tell us about the limits of a one size fits all US grand strategy?
That last one was a rhetorical question, right? You know the answer to that already, so I don't have to answer that one. But let's just say there is something in having lived in this country for a long time. There is a hankering for simplicity, and it's very much reflected, I think, in scholarship on international relations. The category of grand strategy, which strategy existed for hundreds of years. Along comes Barry Posen and says there's grand strategy. And it was like you put fresh milk before a kitten. They all lapped it up. It was amazing. So when you ask yourself analytically, what is grand strategy? Grand strategy is the accumulation of several strategies. Okay, then I ask you, what's the strategy? Strategy is the accumulation of policies. And they ask you, what's a policy? It's the accumulation of decisions. So we are 4 levels of abstractions up from decision to grand strategy. And I think, if I write out about grand strategy, I feel as the author somewhat grand. I feel good about myself. This must be very important. My subject must be very important. Kennan said at the end of the Cold War, we don't need a grand strategy. He invented the grand strategy, but he never thought of it as a grand strategy. It was made into a grand strategy. The way historians make what happened in 1789 into the French Revolution. Right? So the grand strategy, that's not going to work. The world of regions is, of course, based on the intuition that the world is a complex place, that there are different logics. Let's say ASEAN versus the European, the logic of law, which is a particular legacy of the Roman heritage, right, which didn't exist. There was no Roman Empire. So the role of law in Southeast Asia is very different. But they have equivalent mechanisms, right? And consultation and kowtowing and the whole thing from Asia, it's pretty effective. It works very well. So I always felt the Europeans were a little too full of themselves, saying, well, we are the vanguard of integration. Our regionalism is superior. Everybody else ought to become like us. It was a particular form of Eurocentrism. And the European integration literature of the 1960s was full of it. Right? So the world of regions was in part written to undercut that way of looking at a global world. There is an argument in that book, which distinguishes between globalization and internationalization. And I think that's really important. If you use, in public discourse in America at least, they use the synonyms. And I think it's a mistake. Internationalization is processes in the international system where the actor's identity are clear. They're states or nation states. In processes, the identity of the actors are up for grabs. So what's happening, let's assume, that Meloni and France and Germany, they all take their Trumpian turn, that you get a global full backlash rather than a European exception. maybe that the LDP will have its own right-wing faction taking over the party too. Okay. It will still be, there will be a lot of internationalization because the basic unit of the domestic source of power for these actors will be the nation state, right? For sure the state, and then attempts of creating a coherent nation out of different versions and types of ethno-nationalism. But there will be a lot of globalization left. We have not talked about the environment in this hour and a half, which I find surprising. The environment in American colleges, this is the one issue, the only issue on which students agree. They pretty much divide on everything else. But that this is a matter of vital concern and interest to them. Yesterday we had Earth Day here in the United States, 200 kids show up in downtown Ithaca. Kids, not students. Okay. So global processes, material ones coming out of our material environment, global warming, and cultural ones. I mean, we are living at a historic moment in my mind. I think artificial intelligence, which for me does not mean artificial, it means augmented intelligence, has sped up evolution by about 400 million years in the last 70 years. That is an enormous transformative moment. And we haven't a clue where this is going to lead. If we talked about uncertainty at the beginning, this is deep uncertainty. All we know, it can be for better and it can be for worse. And I'm sort of amused, I'm pretty old. I'm sort of amused by which our silicon billionaires say, well, we've just revised our model of the destruction of humanity because of this. It's gone up from 20 to 25% in the next 5, 7, 15 years, whatever. Einstein and Bohr didn't talk that way. They were haunted by the nuclear holocaust. Now it's like, the probability of doom, P-doom is what Silicon Valley calls it. I don't know what they call it in China. They have it the same, I'm sure, P-doom, like they could calculate it. They don't seem to worry to me about it. They're just hunting it, right? So globalization will persist, intermingled with internationalization. So people use the language of the 1930s sometimes, which I criticized in that book, blocks, that there will be a block, I'm sure this is how John Mersheimer thinks about this regional world. Barry Buzan writes about it as blocks. I think this is compression, unreasonable compression. They were, I think, blocks in the 1930s. The world is not the 1930s. There's just a lot of flow and processes. So the metaphor I use is that these regions look like Swiss cheese. There are a lot of holes. And that will be true whether it's ethno-nationalist states running the world or whether it's liberal cosmopolitan states. I think that will stay. Okay. So the regional world is affected by what comes up from the bottom, the political contestations about identity and exclusion and inclusion, and redistributive struggles, which we've talked about. And it will be influenced by the international power conflicts with inadvertent war, probably increasing, and global processes, primarily technological and environmental, right? That's where I see this regional world. And I think, still looking back at that book, which I wrote 20 years ago, I mean, it was published 20 years ago, but I thought about it for 10 years, starting in the mid-90s. I think it's still basically accurate.
Thank you so much, Professor Katzenstein, for giving us over 90 minutes of your time. We started off this discussion when I asked you to reflect upon your academic career, and you answered that you've always been forward-looking. And I'm glad that we did manage to end on a question which is forward-looking rather than one in which you engaged in a reminiscence. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And I hope our questions were fine and that you felt that they were worth responding to. And
well, let me just say, this is, I don't know whether you're undergraduates or graduates or postdocs or whatever, but the level of knowledge you have and the thoughtfulness of the question was absolutely outstanding. So congratulations to all of you, even though with one or two of you, I couldn't quite hear well enough. With most of you I could, but it was an outstanding hour and a half. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, sir. We are really elated that you look back at this conversation so generously. Thank you so much, sir.